I woke up to the sound of chainsaws. At first, I thought the city was trimming trees along the road. Then I looked out my bedroom window and watched my neighbor's crew cutting down the 30-year-old maple trees that stood entirely inside my backyard. I ran outside yelling for them to stop, but the last trunk crashed into the ground before anyone even looked at me. My neighbor walked over smiling. "You were going to lose them eventually," he said. Then he laughed. "Go ahead, sue me." The workers packed up, the logs disappeared on a flatbed truck, and by sunset my backyard looked like a construction site instead of the peaceful place I'd spent years building. The police called it a civil matter. The city inspector couldn't force immediate compensation. Even my lawyer warned me not to expect much. For 3 weeks, my neighbors celebrated like he'd already won. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of his homeowner's insurance company. The woman on the other end asked one question. "Mr. Carter, is now a good time to discuss the full value of the trees your neighbor destroyed?" That was the exact moment everything changed. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 34 years old. And until last spring, I thought the biggest problem I'd ever have as a homeowner was keeping the grass green through another dry Illinois summer. I worked as a senior project manager for a commercial construction company, which meant I spent most weekdays solving other people's problems. Home was supposed to be the one place where everything felt peaceful. My wife, Melissa, and I had bought our house 9 years earlier. We fell in love with it the moment we stepped into the backyard. 3 towering sugar maples shaded nearly the entire property. In the fall, their leaves turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. In the summer, they kept the yard cool enough that we could eat dinner outside almost every evening. Those trees weren't just landscaping. They were where our daughter learned to swing. They were where neighborhood barbecues happened every 4th of July. They were part of every family photograph we'd taken in that backyard. They made the house feel established, private, and alive. Then, 2 years after we moved in, my neighbor, Brian Holloway, bought the property next door. Brian had the kind of confidence that made people mistake arrogance for success. He always had a new truck, always seemed to have contractors working on something, and always believed every disagreement ended the moment he declared himself right. At first, the problems were small. His guests parked across part of my driveway. His landscapers occasionally crossed onto my lawn. He stacked construction materials a few feet over the property line, then acted surprised whenever I politely asked him to move them. Every conversation ended the same way. "You worry too much, Ethan." I tried being patient because everyone said difficult neighbors eventually settled down. Brian never did. Instead, every year his behavior became bolder. He trimmed branches hanging over his fence without asking. He claimed the previous owner had always let him use part of the side yard, even though that made absolutely no sense since he'd only recently moved in. Whenever another neighbor complained, Brian somehow talked his way out of responsibility. People stopped arguing with him because it simply wasn't worth the headache. I should have realized that letting small things slide only convinced him he could get away with bigger ones. Looking back now, I can see every warning sign. I just never imagined the first sound I'd hear one Tuesday morning would be chainsaws, followed by the crash of something that had taken decades to grow. I threw on my shoes so fast I didn't even bother tying the laces. By the time I reached the back door, another chainsaw roared to life, and the entire house seemed to vibrate with its sound. The moment I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. 3 men wearing bright safety vests were already halfway through cutting the largest maple. Thick ropes were wrapped around the trunk, while another worker guided the falling branches away from Brian's fence. "Stop!" I shouted as I ran across the yard. "Those trees are on my property." The chainsaw stopped for only a second. One of the workers looked toward a man standing comfortably with his hands in his pockets. "Brian." He gave a lazy shrug. "Keep going." The saw screamed back to life. I reached the crew just as another massive branch crashed into my lawn, scattering leaves and splintered wood everywhere. I said stop. I yelled. The foreman stepped between me and the equipment. "Sir, we're working under a signed contract. That contract doesn't give you permission to cut my trees." He looked genuinely uncomfortable. "We were told these trees belong to the owner next door." "They don't." Brian walked over with a grin that immediately made my blood boil. They're too close to my property, he said. I've been looking at these things for 2 years. They're entirely inside my yard. So prove it. Before I could answer, the chainsaw bit through the final section of the trunk. For a split second, everything became strangely quiet. Then 30 years of growth leaned, cracked, and came crashing into my backyard with a thunderous impact that shook the ground beneath my feet. The workers immediately started cutting the fallen trunk into manageable sections while another truck backed through Brian's driveway to haul away the logs. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The officers arrived about 25 minutes later. They listened to both sides, walked around the property, and examined the freshly cut stumps. One officer finally sighed. This appears to be a property line dispute. Were you just going to let him steal my trees? I asked. I'm saying this is a civil matter. You'll likely need a survey and possibly legal action. Brian couldn't hide his smile. As the officers walked back to their patrol car, he folded his arms and looked directly at me. I told you, he said with a laugh. Go ahead, sue me. The last truck pulled away carrying what had once shaded my family for nearly a decade. By sunset, nothing remained except 3 enormous stumps, scattered sawdust, and an empty stretch of sky where green leaves had stood only hours earlier. Standing there in the silence, I realized Brian wasn't acting like someone worried about getting caught. He looked like someone who believed he'd already won. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of those trunks crashing into the ground all over again. By sunrise, I gave up on sleep, grabbed a notebook, and walked into the backyard. The destruction looked even worse in daylight. Fresh sawdust still covered the grass. Deep tire tracks cut across the lawn where the logging truck had driven. The 3 stumps stood like ugly monuments, each surrounded by broken branches the crew hadn't bothered to clean up. Instead of letting anger take over, I started documenting everything. I photographed every stump from multiple angles, every tire mark, every pile of sawdust, every section of the fence. Then I pulled out my measuring tape and compared the distance from each stump to the fence separating our properties. None of the measurements made sense. The closest stump was still several feet inside my yard. I walked into the garage and searched through the folder containing all the paperwork from when Melissa and I bought the house. Buried inside was a copy of the original property survey. I spread it across the kitchen table. The drawing clearly showed the property line, along with permanent survey monuments that had been installed decades earlier. According to the survey, every single tree had been planted well inside my lot. Brian hadn't trimmed branches hanging over his fence. He had removed trees that weren't even close to belonging to him. That explained something I'd been thinking about since yesterday. He had never once argued about where the actual property line was. He'd simply acted like confidence was enough to make him right. Still, paper wasn't enough. If this ever ended up in court, I needed current, professional proof. That afternoon, I called a licensed land surveying company that had worked throughout our county for nearly 30 years. The receptionist listened carefully before saying, "We can have a survey crew there tomorrow morning." I booked the appointment immediately. Later that evening, Brian wandered into his backyard carrying a drink as if nothing had happened. He noticed me standing beside the stumps. Still upset, he called across the fence. I hired a surveyor. He laughed loud enough for 2 nearby neighbors to hear. Waste of money. We'll see. He raised his bottle with a smug grin. You're going to find out those trees were never yours. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked back at the old survey folded under my arm. For the first time since the chainsaw started, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about facts. And somehow, I had a feeling facts were about to become Brian's biggest problem. The survey crew arrived at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. 2 pickup trucks pulled into my driveway, each carrying bright orange equipment cases, tripods, and long measuring poles. The lead surveyor introduced himself as David Reynolds, a calm man in his late 50s who had spent more than 3 decades settling property disputes. I hear you've got a boundary disagreement, he said. You could say that. David didn't ask for my opinion first. He asked for documents. I handed him the original property survey from our closing paperwork. He studied it for a moment, nodded, then motioned for his crew to begin setting up their equipment. Within minutes, laser instruments were pointed across both yards. Long measuring tapes stretched between markers. Everything was recorded carefully. Nothing was rushed. About 20 minutes later, Brian walked outside, carrying a mug of coffee. He leaned against his fence with an amused smile. "So, this is what you're spending money on." I ignored him. David didn't. He simply continued checking measurements before stopping near the back corner of my lot. "Interesting," he murmured. He knelt down and brushed away years of packed dirt with a small hand shovel. After a few careful scrapes, something metallic appeared beneath the soil. David smiled. "Found one." He lifted a weathered steel survey monument that had been buried just below the surface. One of his assistants immediately called out another measurement. They searched the opposite corner. A second original survey marker appeared exactly where the old documents indicated it should be. Brian's smile began to fade. David entered several numbers into a handheld device before walking slowly toward us with a clipboard. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I've completed enough measurements to tell you something with complete confidence." I held my breath. "Every one of those tree stumps is entirely inside your property." Brian stepped forward. "That's impossible." David calmly shook his head. "No, sir. What's impossible is claiming those trees were yours." He pointed toward the steel markers. "These original monuments establish the legal property boundary. They've likely been here for decades." Brian crossed his arms. "Your equipment has to be wrong." David actually chuckled. "I've been licensed for 34 years. The equipment isn't guessing." His crew finished collecting the final measurements while Brian stood silently beside the fence. The confidence he'd shown yesterday was gone. Before leaving, David handed me a signed preliminary report. "The official certified survey will be ready in 2 days," he said. "But I'll tell you now exactly what it will say." I looked down at the neatly drawn boundary lines. Not a single stump crossed them. For the first time since those chainsaws started, I felt something replacing the anger. Hope. And judging by the look on Brian's face, he had just realized this wasn't going to end the way he'd imagined. The certified survey arrived exactly 2 days later. Every measurement matched David's preliminary findings. The property line was unmistakable, and every stump sat well inside my backyard. Seeing it printed on official letterhead felt satisfying, but my attorney gave me a reminder I hadn't expected. "The survey proves ownership," she said. "Now we have to prove the value of what was destroyed." "I know what the trees were worth," I replied. She shook her head. "No, you know what they meant to you. Courts need something more specific." That afternoon, she recommended hiring a certified consulting arborist. I had never even heard the term before. The arborist, Michael Sanders, arrived carrying a clipboard, measuring tools, and a thick reference manual. He spent nearly 3 hours examining the stumps, studying old photographs of my backyard, checking trunk diameters from the remaining cuts, and identifying each species. He asked surprisingly detailed questions. When were these planted? Have they ever shown signs of disease? Were they professionally maintained? I answered everything as accurately as I could. Finally, Michael closed his notebook. These weren't ordinary backyard trees. I waited. They were healthy, mature sugar maples that had decades of remaining life expectancy. So what does that mean? It means people often confuse lumber value with landscape value. He explained that the logs hauled away were worth relatively little compared to what the living trees contributed to the property. Their shade reduced cooling costs. Their root systems stabilized the soil. They increased privacy. They enhanced curb appeal. Most importantly, mature ornamental trees couldn't simply be replaced by planting young saplings. "You lost something that took 30 years to grow," he said. "That has measurable value." A week later, his written report arrived. I opened the envelope, expecting a number that would probably cover new landscaping. Instead, I stared at the final page for nearly a full minute. The estimated replacement value, restoration costs, and related damages were far higher than I had imagined. I read the total again, just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. My attorney smiled when I handed her the report. "I've seen cases like this before," she said. "People think cutting down someone else's trees is no different than trimming bushes." She tapped the appraisal with her finger. "Then reality catches up with them." For the first time since everything began, I understood why Brian had been so confident. He thought he destroyed a few trees. He had absolutely no idea what those trees were actually worth. I expected Brian to become nervous after receiving the certified survey. Instead, he became even more arrogant. 3 days after the report arrived, I watched him standing in his driveway, talking with 2 neighbors. The moment he noticed me walking to my mailbox, he smiled and spoke just loudly enough for me to hear. Some people waste a lot of money chasing lawsuits they'll never win. Neither neighbor responded. They looked uncomfortable, but Brian didn't seem to notice. He was enjoying the performance. Later that afternoon, another envelope arrived from my attorney. Inside was the certified survey, the arborist's appraisal, and a formal demand letter prepared for Brian. It explained exactly what had happened. It listed the evidence. It requested compensation before legal proceedings became necessary. Brian received it the following morning. I knew because less than an hour later he marched across the street holding the unopened envelope. "You actually hired lawyers?" he demanded. "I hired professionals. This is ridiculous. I stayed on my porch. You cut down my trees. They were causing problems. They were on my property. They were close enough." I almost laughed. That's not how property lines work. His face reddened. "You think some paperwork is going to scare me?" "No." "What then?" "The truth." Brian crumpled the envelope in his hand. "My insurance isn't paying you a dime. I never said they would. They'll laugh at this." He tossed the envelope onto my porch and walked away before I could answer. For the rest of the week, Brian acted as though nothing had happened. He mowed his lawn, washed his truck, hosted friends on his patio. Every time I looked outside, he seemed completely relaxed. Meanwhile, I stayed busy. Every photograph was backed up in 3 different places. Every receipt went into a folder. I organized a survey, the arborist report, the police incident number, and every conversation I'd documented since the chainsaws arrived. My attorney complimented the organization. "Most cases become difficult because people rely on memory," she said. "You're relying on evidence." That made me feel better. Still, part of me wondered if Brian was right. Maybe this would drag on for years. Maybe I'd spend thousands on legal fees with nothing to show for it. Then, late Friday afternoon, my attorney called. "I've reviewed everything again," she said. "Did I miss something?" "No." There was a brief pause. "I think your neighbor made one very expensive mistake." "What mistake?" "He didn't cut those trees down himself." I frowned. "The contractor did." "Exactly," she replied. "And licensed contractors leave paper trails." For the first time all week, I smiled. Brian had spent days pretending he had nothing to worry about. He still didn't realize the strongest evidence against him probably hadn't even been discovered yet. The following Monday, I met my attorney at her office downtown. Jennifer Lawson had spent nearly 25 years handling property disputes, and unlike me, she wasn't emotionally attached to the case. She looked at every document with the cold precision of someone searching for facts instead of validation. I spread everything across the conference table. The certified survey, the arborist's report, photographs of the stumps, police notes, even pictures I'd taken while the crew was working. Jennifer studied each one carefully without saying a word. Every few minutes, she circled something with a red pen. Finally, she stopped at one particular photograph. "Who owns this truck?" I looked closer. It showed one of the tree company's vehicles parked partly in Brian's driveway. Their company logo was clearly visible on the driver's door. "I don't know," I admitted. She smiled. "I do. You recognize it? I've dealt with them before." She reached for her laptop and typed the company name into a business registry. "They're licensed, insured, and have been operating in this county for almost 20 years. I don't understand why that matters." "It matters because professional contractors document everything." She leaned back in her chair. "They don't just show up with chainsaws. They had a contract." "Exactly." Her eyes met mine. "And contracts create evidence." She explained that reputable companies usually kept signed work orders, invoices, photographs, customer communications, and internal job notes. If Brian had hired them, there would almost certainly be paperwork explaining who authorized the work. What if they refused to cooperate? I asked. Jennifer shook her head. "They may not have that choice." She explained that once legal proceedings began, business records related to the job could be requested through proper legal channels. They can't simply pretend those documents don't exist. For the first time, I realized Brian wasn't the only person who knew what had happened that morning. There had been witnesses, professional witnesses, people who had asked questions before starting their equipment. Jennifer highlighted another photograph. Did you notice this? The foreman was pointing toward my backyard while Brian stood beside him. It looks like they're discussing something. Exactly. She smiled again. If the crew questioned the property line and Brian insisted those trees belonged to him, that's incredibly important. I felt my pulse quicken. You think they warned him? I think experienced tree crews ask questions whenever they're close to a boundary. She closed the file and slid it toward me. Let's find out. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed with an email from Jennifer. The subject line read simply, "Request for contractor records filed." Brian still believed this case was about 3 missing trees. He hadn't stopped to consider that every business he hired kept records, and records rarely cared whose side they were on. A week after Jennifer requested the contractor's records, she called me just before lunch. I received a response. I could hear something different in her voice. Not excitement, confidence. They cooperated. They cooperated faster than I expected. I drove to her office that afternoon. A thick folder was waiting on the conference table. Jennifer opened it carefully. The tree company carries substantial liability insurance, she explained. Whenever work involves property boundaries, they document every conversation. She handed me the first document. It was the original work order. Customer, Brian Holloway. Requested service. Removal of 3 mature maple trees. Property owner authorization. Confirmed by customer. I stared at the signature. Brian's. Jennifer flipped to the next page. This is where things become interesting. The foreman's job notes had been typed into the company's internal system before the work even began. One sentence was highlighted. Customer advised that trees appeared close to neighboring property. Customer confirmed trees were entirely on his lot and accepted responsibility for ownership. I looked up. They actually asked him? She nodded. They didn't assume anything. The folder contained even more. Photographs taken before the first cut. Wide-angle images showing the trees, the fence, and both houses. The company routinely photographed every large removal in case of future disputes. Jennifer smiled. These pictures actually help your case. The fence line was clearly visible. So were the trees. Another document caught my attention. The foreman's incident report. According to his written statement, I had come outside yelling for the crew to stop before the largest tree was completely cut down. The report also stated that work continued only after Brian insisted he owned the trees and instructed the crew to proceed. He put that in writing? I asked. He did. Jennifer closed the folder. The company followed standard procedure. They asked the right questions, relied on the customer's representations, and documented everything. So Brian can't blame them. Not successfully. For the first time since this started, I wasn't relying only on surveys or expert opinions. Now I had independent witnesses whose business depended on keeping accurate records. People with no reason to protect me. Or Brian. As I left Jennifer's office, my phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line read, "Insurance claim acknowledgement." I opened it while standing beside my car. Brian's homeowner's insurance company had officially confirmed they were beginning their own investigation. The moment I finished reading, I realized something. Brian had lied to the tree company. Now he'd have to explain that same lie to people whose entire job was determining exactly what had happened. 3 weeks passed. If you had looked at Brian from across the street, you would have assumed nothing had happened. Every Saturday, he washed his truck in the driveway. Every evening, he sat on his patio with friends, laughing loudly enough for half the neighborhood to hear. Once, I even caught him pointing toward my backyard while telling someone he's still chasing those trees. His confidence never seemed to crack. Mine almost did. Legal cases move slowly, and patience isn't easy when you're reminded every day of what's missing. The empty spaces where those maples had stood felt impossible to ignore. The afternoon sun now poured straight through my kitchen windows. The backyard that once felt private suddenly felt exposed. Melissa tried to keep my spirits up. We've done everything right, she reminded me one evening. I know. Then let the process work. I wanted to believe her. But every day that passed without news made me wonder if Brian had somehow been right all along. Maybe insurance would deny the claim. Maybe the contractor's records wouldn't matter. Maybe we'd spend months fighting for nothing. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I ignored unknown callers. For some reason, I answered. Mr. Carter, a calm woman asked. Speaking. My name is Rebecca Collins. I'm a senior property claims investigator. She paused. I'm calling on behalf of Holloway Homeowners Insurance. For a second, I couldn't say anything. She continued before I had the chance. Is now a convenient time to discuss the tree removal that occurred on your property? Yes. I've reviewed the certified land survey, the arborist report, the contractor's documentation, and the photographs you've submitted. She sounded organized, methodical, nothing like someone searching for excuses. I have a few additional questions, she said. Of course. Were you present when the work began? I was. Did you personally instruct the crew to stop? Immediately. And did anyone continue the work after your objection? Yes. She was quiet for several seconds, typing notes. Finally, she spoke again. Thank you. I waited. Mr. Carter, I can't discuss every detail while the investigation is active. My heart sank. Then she added one sentence that changed everything. I can tell you that several statements we've received don't appear to match the physical evidence. I sat down without realizing it. What does that mean? It means we're continuing our investigation very carefully. Before ending the call, Rebecca asked me to email one more copy of the original property survey. I'd also appreciate any photographs showing the trees before they were removed. I have plenty. Excellent. As soon as the call ended, I forwarded everything she requested. Across the fence, Brian was trimming hedges with the same relaxed smile he'd worn for weeks. He had no idea that while he enjoyed another ordinary morning, his own insurance company had just started asking questions he might not be able to answer. Rebecca Collins called again 2 days later. This time, her questions were even more specific. Mr. Carter, she began, I'd like to confirm the timeline one last time. I pulled out the folder I'd been carrying everywhere for the past month. The crew arrived just after 8 that morning. And you objected immediately? Before the first tree was completely cut down. She thanked me and moved to the next question. Did Mr. Holloway ever claim uncertainty about the property line while you were present? No. He never said he wasn't sure. Not once. He insisted they were his. Rebecca paused to make another note. That matches the contractor's written statement. For the next 20 minutes, we carefully reviewed every piece of evidence. The certified survey, the arborist's valuation, the photographs taken before and after the removal, the police incident report, even old family pictures that clearly showed the mature trees standing inside my backyard years before Brian ever moved in the neighborhood. When we finished, Rebecca asked one final question. Do you know if Mr. Holloway has provided us with any additional documentation supporting his ownership claim? I honestly don't. I understand. Her tone remained professional. I can't discuss his statements in detail, but I can tell you we've compared them against the physical evidence. I waited. The evidence is remarkably consistent. After the call ended, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the chainsaw started. Confidence. Later that afternoon, Jennifer called. I just received confirmation from the insurance company. What kind of confirmation? They've officially accepted all of our supporting documents into their investigation. So that's good. It's very good. She explained that insurance companies didn't simply rely on what their policyholder claimed. They verified facts independently. Surveyors, arborists, contractors, photographs, witness statements. Everything had to tell the same story. And in your case, Jennifer said, it does. I looked out the kitchen window toward the empty backyard. The missing trees still hurt to look at. But for the first time, I wasn't focused on what had been lost. I was thinking about what had been proven. That evening, I noticed Brian loading golf clubs into the back of his truck. He waved casually as if nothing had changed. I nodded politely. He smiled, climbed into the driver's seat, and drove away. Watching him disappear down the street, I couldn't help wondering whether he had any idea what was happening behind the scenes. Because while he was enjoying a quiet afternoon, a team of investigators had spent weeks comparing every document, every photograph, and every statement. And the more evidence they reviewed, the less believable his story became. 5 days after my last conversation with Rebecca Collins, my phone rang again. This time, I recognized the number immediately. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," she said. "We've completed the valuation portion of our investigation." I closed the laptop on my desk and gave her my full attention. "What happens now? I'd like to explain how the damages were calculated." I expected a single number. Instead, she carefully walked me through every category. The certified arborist report established the replacement value of the 3 mature sugar maples. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. Next, we reviewed the cost of removing the remaining stumps and restoring the damaged soil. She continued without rushing. We also considered professional landscape restoration, irrigation repairs where equipment crossed the property, and the expense of installing replacement trees capable of restoring similar privacy over time. Every sentence added another layer I hadn't even considered. Then she mentioned something completely unexpected. Our independent review also included the measurable impact mature landscaping can have on residential property value. I leaned forward. "So all of that is part of the claim?" "Yes." She paused before adding, "These aren't simply pieces of wood. Mature landscape assets have recognized economic value." When she finally reached the total estimated damages, I almost asked her to repeat the number. It was several times higher than I had imagined when those chainsaws first started. Even after hearing the arborist's estimate, the complete calculation was astonishing. Rebecca explained that multiple specialists had reviewed the figures independently before approving them. The valuation wasn't based on emotion. It was based on documented evidence. After the call ended, I forwarded the summary to Jennifer. She called within 10 minutes. "I've reviewed it. What do you think?" "I think your neighbor believed he destroyed a few trees. And he actually created a financial loss far beyond what most homeowners ever imagine." Later that evening, Melissa and I sat on the back patio watching the sunset through the empty space where the maples had once stood. "I still wish they were here," she said quietly. "So do I. No amount of money could replace the memories tied to those trees." But accountability wasn't about replacing memories. It was about accepting responsibility for destroying something that never belonged to you. Across the fence, Brian was laughing with a friend over dinner. He looked completely relaxed. Watching him, I couldn't help thinking one thing. He still believed the hardest part was over. In reality, the investigation had just placed a price on every decision he'd made that morning, and sooner or later, those numbers are going to reach him. The call finally came the following Monday. It wasn't from my attorney. It wasn't from the insurance company. It was Brian. I almost let it go to voicemail. Curiosity got the better of me. "Hello." There was a long pause before he spoke. "Ethan, can we talk?" His voice sounded different. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the smugness that had followed me for weeks. "What about? I think we should work this out between ourselves." I looked out the kitchen window. Brian was standing in his driveway with his phone pressed against his ear. "I thought you said your insurance company would laugh at me." Another pause. "They're reviewing things." "I know. I don't want this getting any bigger." "It already is." He lowered his voice. "I'll pay to plant new trees." "That's not enough." "I'll pay more." "You had that opportunity before." I made a mistake. I remembered the grin on his face when the last maple hit the ground. I remembered him throwing my attorney's demand letter onto my porch. Most of all, I remembered 2 simple words. "Sue me." "I tried solving this peacefully," I said. "You hired lawyers. After you ignored me." He sighed heavily. "What if I write you a check today?" "It's no longer that simple." "What does that mean?" "It means your insurance company has already opened a formal claim." Silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They told me they're still investigating." "They called me too." "I didn't think." "I know." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. For the first time since all of this started, Brian finally understood that confidence wasn't evidence. Facts were. That afternoon, Jennifer called after speaking with the insurance adjuster. They've requested one final review meeting, she said. Is that normal? Very. What happens after that? They decide responsibility and how the claim moves forward. So we're close. We're very close. Before hanging up, she gave me one piece of advice. If Brian contacts you again asking for a private deal, don't negotiate on your own. I wasn't planning to. Good. She laughed softly. I have a feeling he's becoming much more interested in settling now than he was a month ago. That evening, Melissa and I were watering the new flower beds when Brian slowly walked toward the fence. He stopped several feet away. I'm sorry, he said quietly. The words sounded sincere, but they arrived weeks after the damage had been done. I appreciate you saying that, I replied. He looked relieved for a moment. Then I added, but this isn't mine to make disappear anymore. His shoulders slumped. Without another word, he turned around and walked back toward his house. For the first time, the man who had laughed at every warning wasn't walking with confidence. He was walking like someone who finally understood that consequences had already caught up with him. 2 weeks later, Jennifer called just after 9 on a Wednesday morning. You might want to sit down, she said. I was already standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring out at the empty backyard. I am now. The insurance company has completed its investigation. I waited. They've accepted liability. For a moment, I didn't say anything. After nearly 2 months of surveys, reports, photographs, interviews, and waiting, the words almost didn't feel real. So, it's over? The investigation is. Now, we're finalizing the settlement. Jennifer explained that the insurer had determined Brian authorized the removal of trees that were entirely on my property. Their conclusion relied on the certified survey, the arborist's appraisal, the contractor's records, witness statements, and the photographs collected throughout the investigation. Every independent source pointed to the same conclusion. Brian had made the decision. Everyone else had simply documented it. Later that afternoon, Rebecca Collins called to explain the next steps. We'll be issuing payment based on the approved settlement, she said. The goal is to restore your property as reasonably as possible. She carefully reviewed what the settlement covered. Removal of the remaining stumps, professional grading and soil restoration, replacement landscaping, installation of large nursery-grown trees, repairs to damaged sections of the lawn. Every category had been supported by documentation. Nothing had been guessed. Nothing had been inflated. When the call ended, I walked outside. The backyard still looked incomplete. The sunlight still poured through the open space where towering branches had once stretched across the yard. But for the first time, I wasn't looking at what had been taken. I was looking at what could finally be rebuilt. A few days later, I saw Brian loading boxes into the back of his truck. He looked exhausted. The confidence that had once defined him had completely disappeared. He glanced toward me, but quickly looked away. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. The investigation had already said everything that mattered. Months earlier, Brian believed cutting down someone else's trees would end with a laugh and a careless sue me. Instead, patience, documentation, and the truth had quietly done what anger never could. They had held him accountable. As I turned back toward the house, Melissa slipped her hand into mine. We finally get to move forward, she said. I smiled. For the first time since the chainsaws echoed across the backyard, the future felt a lot brighter than the empty space behind us. Spring arrived just as the restoration work began. For months, the backyard had felt like a reminder of everything we'd lost. Every time I looked outside, my eyes went straight to the empty patches of sky where towering branches had once stretched over the lawn. Now, for the first time, something different was happening. Landscaping crews pulled into the driveway, carrying young but well-established trees, fresh soil, and carefully planned restoration drawings. The project manager walked me through every step. We're not trying to recreate the past overnight, he said. We're rebuilding it the right way. That made sense. Some things couldn't simply be replaced, but they could be restored with patience. Over the next several weeks, damaged soil was removed and replaced. The deep ruts left by heavy equipment disappeared beneath fresh grass. New irrigation lines were installed. Then came the part I'd been waiting for. One by one, the replacement trees were carefully lowered into place. They weren't as massive as the originals. Nothing could replace 30 years of growth. But they were healthy, professionally selected, and positioned to provide the same beauty for decades to come. Melissa stood beside me as the final tree was planted. "It already feels different," she whispered. I nodded. "It finally feels like we're moving forward." As the weeks passed, neighbors who had stayed quiet during the dispute slowly began stopping by. Several admitted they had assumed Brian must have been right because he had sounded so certain. Others apologized for not speaking up sooner. One elderly neighbor smiled and said something I'll never forget. "The loudest person on the street isn't always the one telling the truth." She was right. Facts had spoken much more clearly than confidence ever could. Eventually, even the empty space in our family photographs began to disappear. The new trees started filling out. Fresh leaves appeared. Birds slowly returned to the yard. One Saturday afternoon, our daughter hung a small wooden birdhouse from one of the young maples. Watching her laugh reminded me why I'd fought so hard in the first place. This had never been about money. It had never been about winning an argument. It had been about protecting something our family loved. Looking across the yard, I realized something else had changed. I no longer thought about the morning the chainsaws arrived. Instead, I thought about what came afterward. Preparation, patience, truth. The backyard would need years before it resembled what it once had been. But unlike before, every new leaf represented something more than growth. It represented a fresh beginning built on honesty, resilience, and the simple decision to stand up for what was rightfully ours. It was almost 8 months after everything ended when I saw Brian again. I was trimming the hedge along the front walkway on a cool Saturday morning when I noticed him walking slowly across the street. For a second, I wondered if he was headed somewhere else. Then he stopped at the edge of my driveway. "Morning," he said quietly. I set the hedge trimmers down and walked over. He looked different. The expensive confidence that had once followed him everywhere was gone. His shoulders slumped. His hair had more gray than I remembered. Even his voice carried a kind of exhaustion. "I won't keep you long," he said. I nodded. "I've been wanting to tell you something." I waited. I've replayed that morning in my head 100 times. He looked toward the backyard where the young maple trees now swayed gently in the breeze. I kept telling myself they were just trees. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he continued. "I was wrong." Those 3 words carried more weight than every argument we'd had over the previous year. I convinced myself I could do whatever I wanted because nobody had ever pushed back before. His eyes never left the new trees. I thought being confident meant being right. "It doesn't," I replied calmly. "No." He gave a small, embarrassed smile. "It definitely doesn't." Another silence settled between us. It wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was simply honest. "I know saying I'm sorry won't change anything," Brian said. "It won't." I figured. He took a slow breath before extending his hand. I still wanted to say it. After a brief moment, I shook his hand. Not because everything had been forgiven, not because the past had disappeared, but because carrying bitterness any longer wouldn't help either of us. Brian thanked me, turned around, and quietly walked back across the street. I watched until he disappeared inside his house. Melissa stepped onto the porch a moment later. What did he want? To apologize. Do you believe him? I looked toward the backyard. The replacement trees were already taller than they had been just months earlier. Their branches weren't wide enough to cast much shade yet, but they would someday. "I think he finally understood what he destroyed," I said. Melissa slipped her arm through mine as we stood there together. The original trees were gone forever. Nothing could change that. But life had a remarkable way of growing again when you gave it time. Some people believe they can erase years of growth with one careless decision. What they forget is that truth has deep roots. Given enough patience, it always finds its way back into the light. And in the end, that truth became stronger than anything my neighbor ever tried to cut down.